Hello and welcome to this evening's journey through time. Tonight we shall unfold another page of history and listen closely to the voices it left behind. Perhaps you are lying in bed, your screen dimmed, or perhaps you have simply chosen to let the past keep you company for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you would like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world and what time it is for you. If you find comfort in slow, thoughtful stories about the people who came before us, I would be honored if you subscribe. If you find yourself drawn to these explorations of humanity's hidden chapters, consider subscribing so you never miss our ventures into the forgotten realms of history. Now make yourself comfortable as we descend into a world where healing and suffering walked hand in hand, where the line between medicine and harm blurred like morning mist, and where the very act of seeking relief could seal your fate. Picture, if you will, a world shrouded in uncertainty and ancient belief, where the human body remained a mystery wrapped in religious teaching and old tradition. This was medieval Europe, an era spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, where medicine existed in a realm between primitive ritual and scholarly theory, yet remained woefully divorced from what we would recognize as scientific practice. The medieval physician cut a distinctive figure as he made his rounds through cobblestone streets and manor halls. Clad in his distinctive long robes, often black or deep blue, he carried an air of learned authority that commanded both respect and apprehension. Upon his head sat a peculiar pointed cap, and around his neck hung various amulets and charms believed to ward off the very diseases he sought to treat. Most striking of all was his leather beak-like mask during times of plague, stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices, giving him the appearance of some otherworldly creature stepped forth from the realm of nightmares. Yet, for all his imposing presence, the medieval doctor's understanding of the human body was fundamentally flawed. Built upon a foundation of ancient theories that had remained largely unchanged for over 1,000 years. The dominant medical theory of the age was that of the four humors, a system inherited from the ancient Greek physician Galen, whose works had been translated and preserved by Islamic scholars before making their way back to medieval Europe. According to this theory, the human body contained four vital fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with specific qualities, temperatures, and even personality traits. Blood was considered hot and moist, linked to a sanguine temperament characterized by optimism and passion. Phlegm was cold and moist, associated with a phlegmatic nature marked by calmness and sluggishness. Yellow bile was hot and dry, connected to a choleric disposition of anger and irritability. Black bile was cold and dry, tied to a melancholic temperament of sadness and introspection. Health, according to this system, depended entirely upon maintaining the proper balance of these four humors within the body. Disease was simply the result of an imbalance, an excess or deficiency of one or more humors that disrupted the body's natural harmony. This seemingly logical explanation for illness would dominate medical thinking for centuries, leading to treatments that were not only ineffective, but often more harmful than the diseases they purported to cure. The most common and devastating of these treatments was bloodletting, a practice that would claim countless lives throughout the medieval period. Physicians believed that many illnesses resulted from an excess of blood in the body, creating a state of imbalance that could only be corrected by removing the surplus fluid. The methods employed for this procedure varied, but all shared a common disregard for what we now understand about the vital role blood plays in maintaining life. The most straightforward approach involved making incisions in the patient's arms or legs with a sharp knife, allowing blood to flow freely into waiting bowls. Physicians would carefully monitor the amount of blood collected, sometimes removing quantities that would leave modern medical professionals aghast. It was not uncommon for a single bloodletting session to drain a pint or more of blood from an already weakened patient, often pushing them closer to decline rather than recovery. For those who could afford more sophisticated treatment, physicians employed an array of specialized instruments designed to make the bloodletting process more precise. Sharp lancets with gleaming blades could create clean incisions, while spring-loaded devices called fleams could make multiple cuts simultaneously. The wealthy might even request the use of golden or silver instruments, believing that the noble metals would somehow purify the blood as it flowed. But perhaps the most unsettling method of bloodletting involved the use of living creatures as medical instruments. Leeches, those segmented aquatic worms with an insatiable appetite for blood, became the physician's allies in the war against humoral imbalance. These creatures were collected from ponds and streams, then carefully applied to the patient's skin where they would attach themselves and begin their feast at the sight of a patient covered in writhing leeches, their bodies slowly swelling with blood, must have been deeply disturbing to witness. Yet physicians praised this method for its supposed precision, claiming that leeches would instinctively know exactly how much blood to remove. In reality, these creatures simply fed until they were satisfied, with no regard for the patient's well-being or survival. Even more unusual was the practice of using heated glass cups to draw blood to the surface of the skin through suction. These cupping procedures involve lighting a candle or piece of burning material inside a glass vessel, then quickly placing the cup over the patient's skin as the flame consumed the oxygen and created a vacuum. The resulting suction would draw the skin upward into the cup, supposedly pulling corrupted humors to the surface where they could be more easily accessed and removed. The circular marks left by cupping were considered signs of successful treatment, dark bruises that proved the physician's skill in drawing out the patient's illness. In reality, these marks were simply evidence of burst blood vessels and damaged tissue, adding injury to an already suffering body. Beyond bloodletting, medieval physicians employed an arsenal of equally disturbing treatments based on their flawed understanding of human anatomy and disease. Purging, the violent expulsion of stomach contents through induced vomiting, was considered essential for removing corrupted humors from the digestive system. Patients were forced to consume nauseating concoctions designed to trigger the most violent possible reaction, leaving them weakened and dehydrated from the ordeal. The substances used to induce vomiting were often as questionable as the diseases they purported to treat. Mercury, a toxic heavy metal that we now know causes severe neurological damage, was commonly administered in various forms. Patients who survived the immediate effects of mercury exposure often suffered from tremors, memory loss, and behavioral changes that were mistakenly attributed to their original illness rather than the treatment itself. Antimony, another problematic substance, was favored for its reliable ability to cause violent purging. This metallic element was sometimes fashioned in the cups from which patients were required to drink wine, allowing the toxic metal to leach into the liquid and ensure a thorough cleansing of the digestive system. The fact that many patients experienced severe complications from such treatments was often explained away as evidence that their humoral imbalance had been too severe to correct. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the medieval practice of trepanation, the surgical removal of portions of the skull to treat various ailments. This ancient procedure, which had been performed by various cultures for thousands of years, reached new heights of severity in medieval Europe. Physicians believed that many mental and physical ailments resulted from trapped vapors or corrupted humors within the skull, conditions that could only be relieved by creating an opening to allow the harmful substances to escape. The tools used for trepanation were crude by any standard, resembling instruments one might find in a workshop more than medical devices. Hand-cranked drills with rough metal bits would slowly bore through the skull bone while the patient remained conscious. as effective pain relief did not exist. The grinding sound of metal against bone, combined with the patient's cries of suffering, must have created a scene from the deepest nightmares. Some physicians preferred to use a technique called scraping, which involved using a rough metal instrument to gradually wear away portions of the skull until a hole was created. This method was considered more controlled than drilling, but it prolonged the patient's ordeal considerably, as the procedure could take hours to complete. The circular pieces of bone removed during trepanation were sometimes kept as medical specimens or even fashioned into amulets believed to possess healing properties. These items served as reminders of the physician's skill and the patient's suffering, though they provided no actual medical benefit to anyone. Survival rates for trepanation were poor, with most patients experiencing complications either during the procedure or from subsequent infections. Those fortunate enough to survive often suffered from permanent challenges, difficulties, or other neurological complications that left them in worse condition than before the surgery. Yet physicians continued to recommend and perform trepanation throughout the medieval period, convinced that their theoretical understanding of humoral medicine justified even the most extreme interventions. The medieval physician's arsenal also included a bewildering array of substances that ranged from the merely ineffective to the actively harmful. Crushed pearls were administered to wealthy patients as a remedy for various ailments, based on the belief that their luminous beauty contained healing properties. The astronomical cost of such treatments meant that only the nobility could afford them, creating a system where the wealthy received the most exotic and supposedly powerful medicines. Powdered unicorn horn. Actually, the tusk of a narwhal whale was among the most prized and expensive medicines available. This rare substance was believed to possess the power to neutralize any harm and cure virtually any disease. The fact that no one had ever actually seen a unicorn did nothing to diminish faith in the healing properties of its horn, and the exorbitant prices commanded by supposed unicorn horn made it a symbol of ultimate medical luxury. Even human body parts were considered valuable medicines under the right circumstances. The skull of a young person who had met an untimely end was ground into powder and administered to patients suffering from epilepsy or other neurological disorders. Hair from executed criminals was believed to possess special properties for treating various conditions, while rendered fat from the same source was used as an ointment for wounds and skin ailments. These disturbing remedies reflected the medieval belief that suffering could somehow be transformed into healing power through the proper application of medical knowledge. The more dramatic or unusual the source of a medicine, the more potent it was believed to be, leading physicians to seek out increasingly questionable materials for their treatments. Animal-based remedies were equally unusual and often risky. Viper's flesh was considered an excellent treatment for leprosy, requiring patients to consume the meat of venomous snakes in the hope of addressing their condition. The reasoning behind this treatment was that the snake's ability to shed its skin represented a form of renewal that could be transferred to human patients suffering from skin conditions. Spider webs were commonly applied to wounds as a form of bandage, based on the observation that insects became trapped and expired when they encountered these sticky structures. Physicians reasoned that spider webs must therefore possess the power to trap and eliminate the evil humors that caused wounds to fester and fail to heal. In reality, the unsanitary conditions under which these webs were collected often introduced additional contaminants to already infected wounds. The medieval fascination with astrology added another layer of complexity to medical practice. Physicians believed that the movements of celestial bodies had direct influence over human health, with each part of the body governed by specific planets and zodiacal signs. Treatment timing was considered essential. as medicines administered under the wrong astrological conditions were believed to be ineffective or even harmful. This cosmic approach to medicine meant that patients suffering from urgent conditions might be forced to wait days or weeks for the stars to align properly before receiving treatment. Emergency medical care was essentially impossible under such a system, as physicians refused to act against what they perceived as the natural order of the universe. The complexity of astrological medicine also provided physicians with a convenient explanation when their treatments failed to produce the desired results. If a patient declined despite receiving proper medical care, it could always be attributed to unfavorable planetary influences or the patient's failure to follow astrological dietary restrictions. Surgical procedures, when they were attempted at all, were conducted under conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. The concept of sterile technique was completely unknown, with surgeons using the same unwashed instruments on multiple patients without any attempt at cleaning or disinfection. Operating rooms were often little more than ordinary chambers with adequate lighting, lacking any of the specialized equipment or environmental controls we associate with modern surgery. Pain relief, as we understand it today, simply did not exist in medieval medicine. Patients undergoing surgical procedures were expected to endure the full intensity of the operation while remaining conscious and aware. Some physicians attempted to dull the pain by administering large quantities of alcohol or opium-based preparations. But these primitive remedies were often insufficient to provide meaningful relief during major procedures. The crude surgical instruments available to medieval physicians were frequently adapted from other trades, with blacksmiths and metal workers modifying their tools for medical use. Saws designed for cutting wood or bone were employed for amputations, while instruments originally intended for leatherworking were pressed into service for more delicate procedures. The rough, unpolished surfaces of these tools created additional trauma to tissues and provided ideal conditions for contamination. Wound care following surgery was equally primitive and risky. Physicians believed that the formation of certain discharge was a necessary and healthy part of the healing process, actively encouraging the development of infections that they termed laudable. Wounds were deliberately kept open and unclean to promote this supposedly beneficial process, leading to countless complications that could have been easily prevented with proper hygiene. The medieval understanding of anatomy was severely limited by religious prohibitions against human dissection and a reliance on ancient texts that contained numerous errors and misconceptions. Most physicians had never actually examined the inside of a human body, instead basing their knowledge on the works of ancient authorities like Galen, whose anatomical studies had been conducted primarily on animals. This second-hand knowledge led to fundamental misunderstandings about basic human physiology that persisted for centuries. The heart was believed to be the source of thought and emotion, while the brain was considered primarily a cooling system for the blood. The liver was thought to be the center of blood production, with veins and arteries believed to carry entirely different types of fluid throughout the body. Such anatomical ignorance made surgical procedures even more hazardous than they would have been under the best of circumstances. Physicians operating on patients had only the vaguest understanding of what they might encounter inside the body, leading to countless instances of accidental damage to vital organs and blood vessels. The treatment of mental illness in medieval times was particularly severe, reflecting a complete lack of understanding about the nature of psychological disorders. Mental patients were often believed to be possessed by malevolent spirits or evil influences, leading to treatments that focused on driving out these supernatural forces rather than addressing any underlying medical conditions. Exorcism was a common treatment for mental illness. involving prolonged rituals designed to force otherworldly entities to abandon their human hosts. These ceremonies could last for days or weeks, with patients subjected to constant prayers, holy water, and various religious artifacts intended to repel evil influences. The physical and psychological stress of such treatments often worsened the patient's condition significantly. When religious treatments failed to produce results, physicians might resort to more aggressive physical interventions. Patients were sometimes confined in dungeons or cellars for extended periods, based on the belief that isolation from external stimuli would allow their minds to heal naturally. The reality was that such confinement often led to further deterioration of the patient's mental state, creating a cycle of worsening symptoms and increasingly harsh treatments. Physical correction and other forms of bodily intervention were also considered legitimate medical treatments for mental illness. Physicians believed that shocking the patient's system through discomfort might restore the proper balance of humors in the brain, leading to sessions where patients were subjected to various forms of distress in the name of medical care. The medieval period also saw the rise of epidemic diseases that challenged the limited medical knowledge of the time and exposed the inadequacy of contemporary treatments. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, eliminated an estimated one-third of the population and revealed the complete helplessness of medieval medicine in the face of infectious disease. Physicians had no understanding of how the plague spread or what caused it, leading to a proliferation of theories that ranged from astrological explanations to divine retribution for human transgressions. Treatment attempts were based on these flawed theories, resulting in interventions that often hastened decline rather than promoting recovery. Bloodletting was employed extensively during plague outbreaks, based on the belief that the disease resulted from corrupted humors that needed to be expelled from the body. Weakened plague victims were subjected to massive blood loss that left them even less capable of fighting off the infection, contributing to the astronomical mortality rates observed during epidemic periods. Other plague treatments included the burning of aromatic substances to purify the air, the wearing of protective amulets and charms, and the consumption of various herbal preparations believed to strengthen the body's natural defenses. None of these interventions had any real effect on the course of the disease, and many may have actually increased the risk of infection by encouraging people to remain in contaminated areas rather than fleeing to safer locations. The failure of medieval medicine to provide effective treatment for the plague led to widespread social upheaval and a crisis of confidence in established medical authorities. People began to question the wisdom of physicians who had promised remedies but delivered only sorrow, leading to challenges against medical practitioners and the rejection of traditional treatments in favor of folk remedies and religious interventions. Yet, despite these failures and the enormous suffering they caused, medieval physicians maintained their authority and continued to practice their art throughout the period. The lack of alternative explanations for disease and the human need to believe that suffering could be alleviated ensured that people continued to seek medical care, even when experience suggested that such care was more likely to cause harm than to help. The medieval medical system was also deeply intertwined with social and economic hierarchies that determined who received treatment and what kind of care they could expect. Wealthy patients could afford the services of university-trained physicians who, despite their flawed knowledge, at least had access to the most current medical theories and the finest instruments available. Those of lesser means, on the other hand, were more likely to receive care from local healers, barber surgeons, and other practitioners whose knowledge was even more limited and whose methods were often more severe. These lower-tier medical providers lacked access to expensive medicines and sophisticated instruments, leading them to rely on cruder and more direct interventions. The economic incentives of medieval medical practice also encouraged physicians to recommend expensive and dramatic treatments over simpler and potentially more effective approaches. Bloodletting, purging, and surgical procedures commanded higher fees than basic nursing care or dietary recommendations, creating a system where financial considerations often overrode medical judgment. This commercialization of suffering meant that patients who could afford to pay were more likely to receive aggressive interventions, while those who could not pay were more likely to be left alone to recover naturally, somewhat unexpectedly. Those of limited means often had better survival rates simply because they could not afford the interventions that were harming their wealthier neighbors. As we delve deeper into the realities of medieval medicine, we begin to understand how a system built on limited knowledge, traditional belief, and economic factors could persist for centuries despite its obvious shortcomings. The combination of religious authority, social hierarchy, and the absence of scientific method created an environment where questionable practices could flourish unchallenged, leaving countless individuals affected in their wake. Legacy of medieval medicine serves as a sobering reminder of the importance of evidence-based practice and the risks of accepting medical interventions based solely on tradition or authority. The suffering endured by medieval patients was not simply the result of limited technology or knowledge, but of a systematic failure to question established beliefs and practices in the face of overwhelming evidence of their inadequacy. As we continue our exploration of medieval medicine, we encounter perhaps the most troubling aspect of all: the complete absence of what we would recognize today as informed consent or patient advocacy. In this era, the physician wielded absolute authority over the bodies and fates of those who sought healing, creating a dynamic that was as much about power and social control as it was about medicine. Picture, if you will, the typical medieval patient. Whether peasant or noble, they entered the physician's domain in a state of complete vulnerability and ignorance. Medical knowledge was jealously guarded by the learned elite, written in Latin and shrouded in mystical terminology that served to maintain the doctor's elevated status. Patients had no understanding of their conditions, no knowledge of alternative treatments, and certainly no right to refuse the prescribed remedies, no matter how unusual or hazardous they might seem. The psychological impact of this power imbalance cannot be overstated. Imagine being told by a learned man draped in the authority of both church and university that your salvation depended upon submitting to procedures that your every instinct told you to flee from. The medieval patient existed in a constant state of apprehension, caught between the worry of their illness and the distress of their treatment. This dynamic was particularly difficult for women, who faced an additional layer of medical bias that pervaded every aspect of their care. Medieval physicians, almost exclusively male, viewed the female body as inherently mysterious and problematic. Women's health issues were routinely attributed to moral failings or supernatural influences, leading to treatments that were as much about judgment as they were about healing. Consider the medieval understanding of childbirth, one of the most natural and fundamental human experiences. Rather than being seen as a normal biological process, childbirth was viewed as a burden imposed upon womankind for ancestral transgressions. This theological framework meant that women in labor were often denied pain relief, as their suffering was considered both deserved and spiritually necessary. When complications arose, the solutions were typically severe, crude surgical interventions without pain relief, forceful manipulations, or the administration of questionable substances believed to speed delivery. The mortality rates tell a grim story. It is estimated that between 10 and 20% of medieval women perished in childbirth. with many more suffering permanent injuries that would affect them for the remainder of their often shortened lives. Yet rather than prompting medical professionals to question their methods, these tragic outcomes were simply accepted as fate or blamed on the character of the deceased. Mental health presented another arena where medieval medicine revealed its darkest impulses. The concept of mental illness as we understand it today simply did not exist. Instead, those suffering from depression, anxiety, or other psychological conditions were viewed through the lens of moral and spiritual failure. The treatments that emerged from this worldview were nothing short of severe. Exorcism was considered a standard treatment for what we would now recognize as mental illness. Patients were subjected to intense rituals designed to cast out the forces believed to be possessing them. These ceremonies could last for days, involving physical restraints, prolonged fasting, exposure to extreme temperatures, and psychological distress designed to break the supposed hold of evil. Many patients did not survive these ordeals. Their ends attributed to the strength of the forces within them rather than the severity of their treatment. For those who survived exorcism but showed no improvement, the next step was often confinement in conditions that can only be described as dungeons. Medieval hospitals for the mentally ill were essentially prisons where patients were chained to walls, fed scraps, and left to exist in their own filth. The theory was that physical discomfort would shock the soul back into proper alignment. But the reality was simply systematic dehumanization of society's most vulnerable members. The economic dimensions of medieval medicine added yet another layer of darkness to an already grim picture. Healthcare was not a right, but a luxury available only to those who could afford to pay. This created a system where physicians had financial motivation to prescribe the most expensive and elaborate treatments possible. Regardless of their effectiveness or safety, wealthy patients often received treatments that were more risky than those given to the poor, simply because they could afford more exotic and therefore supposedly more powerful remedies. A rich merchant might be prescribed rare imported minerals or complex alchemical preparations that could easily prove fatal, while someone of limited means received simple herbs that, while ineffective, were at least unlikely to cause immediate harm. This economic stratification extended to every aspect of medical care. The wealthy could afford multiple consultations, allowing them to seek out physicians who told them what they wanted to hear. They could import medicines from distant lands, hire private nurses, and retreat to country estates to recover in relative comfort. Those of lesser means, meanwhile, had no choice but to accept whatever treatment was offered, often from practitioners with minimal training and no accountability. The fee structure itself was designed to extract maximum benefit from desperate patients. Physicians charged not just for their services, but for each component of their treatments. Every herb, every bloodletting session, every consultation carried a separate cost. Families often impoverished themselves trying to save a loved one, only to watch them decline anyway from the very treatments they had sacrificed everything to afford. Perhaps most disturbing was the way this economic model incentivized the prolonging of illness rather than its remedy. A healthy patient was no longer a source of income, creating a situation where successful treatment was actually contrary to the physician's financial interests. While most medieval doctors probably did not consciously prolong their patient's suffering, the system they operated within certainly encouraged practices that kept patients dependent and returning for more expensive treatments. The religious establishment played a significant role in maintaining and legitimizing these medical practices. The Church's doctrine that suffering was spiritually purifying provided convenient justification for treatments that caused tremendous pain. Physicians could defend their most severe procedures by claiming they were helping patients achieve spiritual as well as physical healing through the redemptive power of suffering. This religious framework also served to suppress any questioning of medical authority. To challenge a physician's treatment was tantamount to questioning divine plan, a form of heresy that could have serious consequences. Patients and their families were expected to submit to whatever ordeals were prescribed, viewing their agony as a test of faith rather than a failure of medicine. The Church's control over education meant that medical training was deeply intertwined with religious doctrine. Future physicians learned their craft not through empirical observation and experimentation, but through the study of ancient texts considered sacred and unquestionable. This created a medical establishment that was fundamentally resistant to change, viewing innovation as dangerous pride rather than beneficial progress. The psychological manipulation embedded in medieval medical practice was sophisticated and systematic. Physicians cultivated an aura of mystical knowledge and divine authority that made questioning their methods seem not just foolish but spiritually hazardous. They spoke in Latin, surrounded themselves with arcane instruments and mysterious substances, and performed elaborate rituals that served no medical purpose but reinforced their status as intermediaries between the earthly and divine realms. Patients were deliberately kept in a state of ignorance and dependency. Medical procedures were explained, if at all, in terms so vague and mystical that they conveyed no real information. This was not simply due to the limitations of medieval scientific understanding, but was a deliberate strategy to maintain the physician's authority and the patient's compliance. The placebo effect, though not understood in modern terms, was extensively exploited. Elaborate ceremonies, expensive ingredients, and painful procedures all served to convince patients that they were receiving powerful medicine. The more a treatment cost, the more it caused discomfort, and the more mysterious it seemed, the more likely patients were to believe in its efficacy. This psychological manipulation often produced temporary improvements that served to validate the physician's methods, even when the underlying condition remained unchanged or worsened. Social pressure played an enormous role in maintaining this system. Families who refused conventional treatment for their loved ones faced ostracism and suspicion. Communities rallied around the authority of established physicians, viewing those who sought alternative approaches as dangerous rebels. This social enforcement made it extremely difficult for individuals to break free from the cycle of harmful medical intervention. Even when their own experience suggested that the treatments were making things worse, the few voices that dared to question medieval medical orthodoxy were quickly silenced. Physicians who advocated for gentler treatments or questioned established procedures found themselves accused of incompetence. Patients who recovered using non-traditional methods were often dismissed as having experienced miraculous intervention rather than effective treatment, preventing their experiences from challenging the medical establishment. This systematic suppression of dissent meant that medieval medicine became trapped in a cycle of self-reinforcing error. Harmful practices were maintained not because they worked, but because the system was designed to prevent any meaningful evaluation of their effectiveness. Success was credited to the physician's skill, while failure was blamed on the patient's moral failings, the severity of their condition, or divine will. The legacy of these dark medieval practices extended far beyond the immediate suffering they caused. They established patterns of medical authority and patient submission that would persist for centuries, creating cultural attitudes about medicine and healing that we are still working to overcome today. The idea that effective medicine must be unpleasant, that patients should not question their doctors, and that suffering is an inevitable part of healing, all have their roots in medieval medical practice. Understanding this history is essential, not just for appreciating how far medical science has progressed, but for recognizing the ongoing importance of patient rights, informed consent, and evidence-based practice. The sorrows of medieval medicine remind us that good intentions are not enough. That tradition and authority are poor substitutes for empirical evidence. And that the power dynamics between doctor and patient must be carefully balanced to prevent misuse. As we continue our exploration of medieval medicine's darkest chapters, we must remember that behind every severe procedure and misguided treatment were real human beings enduring unimaginable suffering. Their pain was not made meaningful by the religious and philosophical frameworks used to justify it, nor was their sacrifice in service of medical progress any less tragic for being unintentional. They were individuals affected by a system that prioritized authority over evidence, tradition over innovation, and profit over compassion. The medieval period may seem distant and irrelevant to our modern medical challenges, but the fundamental questions it raises about power, knowledge, and healing remain as pressing today as they were 800 years ago. How do we balance respect for medical expertise with the need for patient autonomy? How do we prevent economic incentives from corrupting medical practice? How do we ensure that our current medical orthodoxies do not blind us to better approaches? These are the lessons that the dark history of medieval medicine has to teach us, written in the experiences of countless forgotten patients who deserve so much better than what their age had to offer. The medieval world was a harsh place, where life hung by the thinnest of threads, and nowhere was this more evident than in the medical practices of the time. What we have explored so far reveals a system built on limited understanding, economic factors, and genuine challenges masquerading as healing. But there remains one more sobering aspect of medieval medicine that perhaps cuts deepest of all: the complete absence of hope for genuine recovery or relief. In our modern world, when we fall ill, we expect to get better. We visit doctors with the reasonable assumption that medical intervention will help us heal. That pain can be managed, that diseases can be addressed. This fundamental expectation of recovery is so ingrained in our thinking that we can barely imagine a world without it. Yet for the medieval patient, hope itself was a luxury they could rarely afford. Consider the psychological burden of living in an age where every minor ailment could signal the beginning of the end. A simple cut might fester and turn gangrenous. A persistent cough could herald the onset of consumption. A fever might be the first sign of plague. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that their bodies were fragile vessels sailing on turbulent seas with no reliable means of navigation or rescue. The wealthy, at least, could afford the elaborate theatrics of medical attention. They could summon physicians with their impressive robes and learned Latin phrases, purchase exotic remedies from distant lands, and commission prayers from entire monasteries. But even these expensive interventions offered little more than the illusion of control. The rich declined just as frequently and painfully as those of lesser means, their gold unable to purchase what did not yet exist: effective medical knowledge. For common people, even this illusion was beyond reach. When a peasant fell ill, their options were severely limited. They might seek help from a local wise woman who knew which herbs could ease certain symptoms. Though even beneficial plants were often prepared incorrectly or contaminated with harmful substances, they could pray, of course, and many did so with desperate fervor, believing that their suffering was either divine judgment for transgressions or a test of faith that might be rewarded with miraculous healing. But more often than not, illness meant simply enduring. Medieval people developed a stoic acceptance of pain that seems almost superhuman by today's standards. They had no choice but to bear excruciating toothaches until the affected teeth fell out or were crudely extracted. They lived with chronic conditions that caused discomfort, knowing that relief would likely never come. Women faced the terrifying prospect of childbirth, knowing that many would not survive it, and that even if they did, watching their children succumb to preventable diseases was a near certainty. The psychological impact of this hopelessness cannot be overstated. Medieval literature is filled with references to the body as a prison, to earthly life as a vale of tears, to passing as a welcome release from suffering. While these themes were certainly influenced by Christian theology, they also reflected the lived reality of people who had little reason to expect their physical circumstances to improve. This despair was compounded by the medical profession's own certainty and limited understanding. Physicians, despite their lack of effective treatments, maintained an air of authority that brooked no questioning. They created elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain disease and suffering, but these frameworks served primarily to protect their own status rather than to help patients. A physician could always explain away a treatment's failure by blaming the patient's constitution, their moral failings, or the alignment of celestial bodies. The doctrine of the four humors, in particular, created a closed system of explanation that was virtually immune to contradiction. If bloodletting failed to address a fever, it was because the patient had too much phlegm, not enough bile, or required a different balance altogether. If a patient declined despite treatment, it was because their humoral imbalance was too severe, or because they had waited too long to seek help, or because their lifestyle had corrupted their natural constitution beyond repair. This systematic deflection of responsibility meant that medical practitioners rarely had to confront the reality of their own ineffectiveness. They could continue to practice harmful procedures while maintaining their sense of professional competence and social standing. Meanwhile, patients and their families were left to blame themselves for treatment failures, adding guilt and self-recrimination to their already overwhelming burden of physical suffering. The absence of hope extended beyond individual illness to epidemic disease, which struck medieval communities with terrifying regularity. The Black Death, which eliminated perhaps one-third of Europe's population in the 14th century, was only the most dramatic example of medicine's helplessness in the face of widespread disease. When plague struck a community, physicians fled alongside everyone else who had the means to do so. Those who remained had nothing to offer but prayers and increasingly desperate remedies that often hastened decline rather than preventing it. During plague outbreaks, the normal social structures that provided at least some comfort to the sick completely collapsed. Families abandoned their own members out of fear of contagion. Those who passed were buried in mass graves without ceremony. The very physicians who claimed special knowledge of the human body proved utterly powerless when their expertise was most needed. These experiences seared into the medieval consciousness a deep understanding of medicine's fundamental powerlessness. Yet, perhaps the most difficult aspect of medieval medicine's hopelessness was how it was disguised and rationalized by those in authority. The Church taught that suffering was spiritually beneficial, that earthly pain was temporary compared to eternal salvation, and that accepting one's afflictions with patience and faith was the highest virtue. While these teachings may have provided some comfort to the suffering, they also served to discourage any serious effort to improve medical knowledge or develop better treatments. Political authorities, meanwhile, had little incentive to invest in medical advancements when their own power rested on maintaining existing social hierarchies. A peasant who perished from preventable disease was simply replaced by another peasant. The suffering of common people was seen as natural and inevitable, not as a problem requiring solution. Even among medical practitioners themselves, there was little recognition that their methods might be fundamentally flawed. The entire system of medical education was based on memorizing ancient texts, rather than observing actual patients. Students learned to recite Galen's theories about blood flow without ever dissecting a human body to see how circulation actually worked. They studied elaborate charts of astrological influences on health without conducting controlled experiments to test whether these influences existed. This educational approach created generations of physicians who were intellectually equipped to debate theoretical points but practically incapable of helping real patients. They could discourse learnedly about the proper balance of hot and cold, wet and dry humors, but they could not recognize the symptoms of common diseases or understand how infections spread. The result was a medical system that was simultaneously highly sophisticated in its theoretical complexity and utterly primitive in its practical effectiveness. Medieval physicians developed elaborate diagnostic procedures, complex pharmaceutical preparations, and detailed treatment protocols that rivaled anything found in the modern world for their intricacy and systematization. But all of this intellectual apparatus was built on foundations of sand, theoretical assumptions that bore little relationship to biological reality. For the medieval patient, this meant living in a world where medical authority was both omnipresent and ineffective. They were surrounded by people who claimed to understand their bodies and their ailments, who spoke with confidence about causes and remedies, who demanded payment and obedience for their services. Yet when crisis struck, when real healing was needed, these authorities had nothing meaningful to offer. The psychological damage of this false hope may have been worse than no hope at all. At least a person who expects nothing can prepare mentally for suffering and decline. But those who place their trust in supposed experts, who submit to painful procedures in the belief that healing will follow, who exhaust their resources pursuing treatments that cannot work, experience not only physical suffering but the additional torment of betrayed faith. This betrayal was particularly acute because medieval medicine demanded so much from its patients while delivering so little in return. Treatments were often more painful than the diseases they supposedly addressed. Patients were required to endure bloodletting until they fainted, purging until they were dangerously dehydrated, surgical procedures without pain relief, and pharmaceutical preparations that were essentially harmful. They submitted to these ordeals because they trusted that their physicians knew what they were doing, that the immediate suffering would lead to eventual relief. When relief failed to materialize, when the patient's condition worsened or the end approached, despite compliance with medical advice, the fault was invariably placed on the patient rather than the treatment. They had not bled enough, had not purged completely, had not maintained the proper diet, had not prayed with sufficient fervor, had not aligned their lifestyle with the physician's recommendations. This systematic victim blaming meant that medical failure never led to medical reform, only to more elaborate explanations for why the failures were really the patient's fault. The hopelessness of medieval medicine was thus not merely a matter of technological limitation or scientific ignorance, though these were certainly factors. It was also a product of social, economic, and intellectual systems that actively prevented the accumulation of genuine medical knowledge while protecting the interests of those who profited from medical ignorance. As we look back on this dark chapter in human history, we can perhaps better appreciate the extraordinary transformation that has occurred in the relationship between healer and patient. The expectation that medical intervention will generally help rather than harm, that physicians will base their treatments on evidence rather than theory, that patients have rights and choices in their care, that suffering can often be alleviated, even when complete resolution is not available. These are revolutionary concepts that would have been almost incomprehensible to our medieval ancestors. Yet we should not congratulate ourselves too quickly on our progress. The dark legacy of medieval medicine still echoes in our modern world, whenever patients are treated as objects rather than people, whenever economic interests override medical ethics, whenever authority figures demand blind obedience rather than informed consent, whenever suffering is dismissed or ignored because it affects the powerless rather than the privileged. The true sorrow of medieval medicine was not just that it failed to heal, but that it systematically crushed the human spirit by offering false hope while delivering real harm. In understanding this history, we can better appreciate both how far we have come and how vigilant we must remain to protect hard-won principles of ethical medical practice that distinguish our age from theirs. Legacy of medieval medical practices extended far beyond the immediate harm they caused. By transforming healing from a charitable calling into a profit-driven enterprise, medieval medical commerce established patterns of exploitation that would persist for centuries. The fundamental conflict between practitioner profit and patient welfare that characterized medieval medicine continues to influence medical systems to this day. The systematic dehumanization of patients that emerged during this period, the treatment of sick people as sources of revenue, rather than human beings deserving of care, represented a profound moral failure that undermined the entire premise of medical practice. When healers became merchants and patients became customers, the sacred trust that should exist between caregiver and patient was irreparably corrupted. The merchants of misery who dominated medieval medical practice left behind a legacy of suffering that extended far beyond their own lifetimes. Their exploitation of human vulnerability and their corruption of the healing arts created deep-seated suspicions about medical authority that persist to this day. They demonstrated how quickly noble intentions could be corrupted by commercial incentives and how easily systems designed to help could be transformed into instruments of exploitation. The medieval medical marketplace, with its elaborate deceptions and sophisticated exploitation, stands as a cautionary tale about what happens when profit becomes the primary motive in healthcare. It shows us how quickly the noble art of healing can be corrupted when commercial incentives override ethical obligations, and how devastating the consequences can be for those who depend on medical care for their survival. In examining these historical patterns of medical exploitation, we gain insights into the eternal tension between commerce and compassion in healthcare. The merchants of misery who dominated medieval medicine may be long departed, but the systems they created and the attitudes they fostered continue to influence medical practice today, reminding us that the struggle for ethical healthcare is never truly won, but must be waged anew by each generation. The medieval world, for all its challenges and limitations, eventually began to give way to new ways of thinking. The Renaissance would bring renewed interest in direct observation and empirical study. The scientific revolution would introduce systematic methods for testing hypotheses and discarding failed theories. The Enlightenment would challenge traditional authorities and demand evidence for extraordinary claims. But these transformations took centuries to unfold, and during all that time, countless individuals suffered and perished under the care of medical practitioners who remained trapped in the paradigms of the past. The story of medieval medicine is not simply a tale of ignorance overcome by knowledge. It is a reminder of how difficult it can be to change established systems, even when those systems are clearly causing harm. It shows us how powerful the combination of economic interest, social hierarchy, and intellectual tradition can be in preserving the status quo, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that change is necessary. The physicians of medieval Europe were not, for the most part, deliberately cruel or malicious individuals. Many genuinely believed they were helping their patients and felt distress when treatments failed. But they were operating within a system that made it nearly impossible to recognize or acknowledge the fundamental flaws in their approach. The same social structures that gave them authority and income also trapped them in worldview that prevented genuine progress. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson we can draw from the dark secrets of medieval medicine. That good intentions are not enough. That sincerity of belief does not guarantee effectiveness of action. And that systems designed to help can become instruments of harm when they are insulated from criticism and protected from accountability. As we reach the conclusion of our journey through medieval medicine, we find ourselves confronted with questions that remain relevant today. How do we balance respect for expertise with the need for accountability? How do we prevent economic incentives from corrupting the healing professions? How do we ensure that patients are treated as partners in their own care rather than passive recipients of authority? How do we create systems that encourage innovation and self-correction rather than defending established practices regardless of their effectiveness? These questions have no simple answers, but understanding the history of medieval medicine helps us appreciate why they matter so deeply. The suffering of those who lived through this era was not meaningless. Their experiences, painful as they were, eventually contributed to a transformation in how we think about health, disease, and the relationship between healers and those they serve. The modern medical system, for all its remaining imperfections, represents an extraordinary achievement built on the recognition of principles that medieval medicine failed to honor. That patients deserve to understand their treatment, that theories must be tested against evidence, that authority must be balanced with accountability, that the relief of suffering should take precedence over the maintenance of tradition. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can find some comfort in knowing that we live in an age when medical care, though still imperfect, is guided by principles of evidence and compassion that would have seemed revolutionary to our medieval ancestors. The physicians who attend us today, for all their human limitations, are constrained by ethical guidelines, professional standards, and legal frameworks that protect patients in ways medieval people could scarcely have imagined. The dark secrets of medieval medicine serve as a reminder of how far we have come and how important it is to preserve and extend the progress we have made. They remind us to question authority when necessary, to demand evidence for extraordinary claims, to insist on our rights as patients, and to remember that the most sophisticated-sounding explanation may still be fundamentally wrong. Most importantly, they remind us that behind every medical system, every treatment protocol, every professional hierarchy, are individual human beings whose suffering matters, whose dignity deserves respect, and whose well-being should always be the ultimate goal of healing. And so, as the shadows lengthen and sleep draws near, we leave behind the troubled world of medieval medicine and return to our own time, grateful for the progress that has been made, mindful of the struggles that remain, and perhaps a little wiser about the eternal challenges of healing the human body and soul. May you rest well tonight, secure in the knowledge that the nightmares of medieval medicine belong to the past, lessons learned through great suffering that have helped create a better, though still imperfect, present. Good night, and sleep peacefully.